All right, good morning, everybody. It is really wonderful to have you all here. My name is Joseph Foy, and I have the privilege of serving as the Vice President for Academic Affairs here at Alverno College. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Alverno College Community Conference. This year's theme, Reaching for Change, Promoting Equity, was chosen by members of the campus community in hopes for continuing to further the important cultural conversation that recognizes the strength and progress that comes from empowering the authentic voice of all members within our diverse communities. While we recognize and honor the many victories that have been earned throughout history in the long march toward equality and justice, we also acknowledge that there is much work to be done. And we embrace the sentiments of powerful leaders for change like Nelson Mandela, who once noted, "It is in our hands to create a better world for those who live in it." Thank you for being here today and for being a part of this important work. I also want to thank all of our presenters and discussants. In a year that has been very challenging and exhausting on so many fronts, we are grateful that you went above and beyond to engage in this important day. I would like to, in particular, thank the members of the Civil Liberties Committee, whose sponsorship of many aspects of today's conference through the Menards CSII Civil Liberties Grant has enabled us to access many important resources and voices. Thank you. Most of all, I want to thank the entire team in the Alverno Assessment and Outreach Center. Julie Borgelt, Rachel Bowersox, Rosalind Briggs-Gammon, Denise Sanders, and Kathy Schwan-Minnick for making today's community conference possible and for all of their dedicated work to advance the Alverno College mission. Without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Amira Adams, also known as Amira the Poet, who has agreed to start our day with an original spoken word piece she composed to share. Amira is a communication major in her first year of study and a member of the inaugural class of scholars who is attending Alverno College as part of the Thea Bowman Institute for Excellence and Leadership. She also serves as the president of the Black Student Alliance and ombudsperson for student government. Amira uses poetry as a tool to educate and inspire youth, peers, educators, and executives. She is a change maker and a community advocate for social justice and human rights. Her family's vision statement reads like this: "Our descendants, each generation will start higher, go further, stumble less, and achieve more." Please join me in welcoming Amira the Poet.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm so excited to read this poem for you all. And this is a specially written poem just for today. It is entitled "The Movement." Sometimes change seems to be so far away. We get discouraged and disappointed, sometimes even go astray. Let us pray. How can we reach for change when our arms don't feel long enough? And how can we promote equity when we can't even find the right words to say? Feel the pumps of your heart and the beat of your soul. What kind of life will make those keep working? What is your perfect world? One where our differences are accepted and seen. What if normal wasn't a thing? Where love runs through every vein, and when we can exist together in peace and not in pain, where our love is not in vain. When existing isn't hiding, but you can actually see me, where our love is blind, but you can see my skin color clearly and won't fear me. Imagine how close we'd be if every arm would reach, and imagine how close we'd be if we break our silence and speak. They say the tongue holds power. Well, how will you use it? Will you speak life, change, equality, equity, or will you choose to abuse it? Think of a time where you didn't use it. Now imagine that moment again. Would you do it? We got this. We can do it. It is about time we take our foot off of the brake and place it straight on the gas, where we can reach our goal and be one at last, but we have to commit to doing the work. We have to commit to put each other first. I have faith that we can figure out what works. I dare you to dream. Now I dare you to work for it. I dare you to use all of your tools and your resources. Are you willing to put your all in it? Can you afford it? Am I worth it? Am I enough for you to say yes to change? And am I enough for me and you to be treated the same in Jesus' name? How important to you is change, and how important to you is equity and unity? I think we need more than a day to be committed to the community. The work doesn't stop after today. This is a daily commitment. Be free and not resistant. This is our mission. We can no longer afford to stay in the same position. It is time to move. Thank you.
Amira, thank you so much for showing us all what Alverno Strong looks like and for inspiring and setting us off on the right foot. Thank you. You were a blessing. I would like to ask Remy Bashi to take a moment to provide information about our interpretation support for this morning's session. Remy?
Good morning, everyone. Besides the sign language interpretation, we will also provide Spanish language interpretation. And for that purpose, the interpretation function on Zoom will be enabled. And when that gets started, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a globe icon. Please click on that and then select your language of preference. Everybody will need to select either English or Spanish. And you can also choose to mute the original language or to be able to hear it at a lower volume. Buenos días a todos. Además de la interpretación del lenguaje de señas, tendremos disponible la interpretación al español. Cuando se inicie la función de interpretación en Zoom, verán en la parte inferior de su pantalla un icono de globo. Podrán seleccionar dando clic en ese icono el idioma inglés o español. Todos deberán seleccionar un idioma y podrán también seleccionar escuchar a un volumen menor el idioma original o ponerlo en silencio. And if you're joining us on an iPad or a phone, you will be able to find the interpretation function once it's started by clicking on the 3 dots that say more. Y si se están sumando a esta reunión a través de un dispositivo como un iPad o un teléfono inteligente, podrán entrar a la función de interpretación cuando den clic en 3 puntos que dice más. Ahí pueden seleccionar el idioma. Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Remy. Our next speaker is Deanna Singh. I first got to know her through her writing, as I found inspiration in her book, Purposeful Hustle, which I shared with family and friends who were in transition and looking for meaning in their life's work. Later, I got the privilege of meeting her with my partner, Christy, as she and I got to enjoy dinner with Deanna and her family. Never before have I met someone whose whole authentic self is brought to every aspect of her life, and someone who shines so brilliantly to inspire others to do the same. Deanna is an accomplished author, educator, business leader, and champion for marginalized communities. As the founder and chief change agent of Flying Elephant, Deanna consults with individuals and companies that are looking to make a positive difference in the world. She is known for giving clients the tools and courage to imagine, activate, and impact the world as agents of change. A social entrepreneur at her core, Deanna is always at the forefront of social change. She has established and operated multiple social innovations, including but not limited to the NYC office of Lyft, which helps people find a way out of poverty for good, and Milwaukee's Street Law Program, an interactive legal program that has taught more than 1,000 Milwaukee students basic legal knowledge. Deanna earned her Bachelor of Arts in Urban Studies from Fordham University, a Juris Doctorate from Georgetown University, and a master's in business administration from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is also the author of 4 children's books: I Am a Boy of Color, I Am a Girl of Color, Cloth Crown, and a forthcoming Girl's Guide with American Girl, and a business book, which I mentioned at the start, Purposeful Hustle. I also want to let you all know that her 2 sons, Zion, age 8, and Zephaniah, age 12, recently followed in their mother's inspirational footsteps and wrote and published their own children's book, Selah's Bridge, which my children and I recently read and loved together. So with that, it is my absolute pleasure and privilege to introduce Deanna Singh.
Well, thank you so very much, Joe. It's amazing to be able to be here with Alverno. I am a huge fan. So, I always tell when I start at Alverno, I always say, hey, just so you know, fangirl here, just so that we can get it out in the clear and everybody knows where I'm coming from. I'm also a huge fan of Joe's and his family and the work that the university has done, and Amira and her family too. I've had the opportunity, now I feel like an auntie, right? But I've had the opportunity to see Amira grow up and to see her claim her voice. And it's so beautiful, Amira, to see you using the power of your voice and really using the power of your brain and your heart to be able to change other people's hearts. So thank you very much for being here with us today too. And I want to say thank you to all of you. This is a big moment, right? And it's not just about this morning, it's not just about this day, but as Amira so beautifully put it, it's about the movement that we all find ourselves in, right? This is an extraordinary time in history as we're dealing with all kinds of different things. And I know we're being pulled in so many different directions. So the fact that you would spend some time here with me today, having this conversation, and for the rest of the day with all the other wonderful presenters that you have lined up means a lot. It says a lot about who you are, and it says a lot about what you care about. And I'm just delighted to be able to have a little bit of time with you. So what we are going to do with our time today is, first, I want to give just a little bit of background. Joe did such a lovely job. Thank you for the introduction. But I want to go just a little bit deeper so you can see some of the connections and the ways that this idea of change really shows up in the work that I get to do on a daily basis. Then what I want to do is I want to share a story with you that illustrates the challenges of exclusion. And then what we're going to do is we're going to reconstruct that story. So as a group, we're going to reconstruct the story through an inclusionary lens. And my goal is to leave you with some specific techniques, some things that you can start to add to your leadership practices as you think about how you can create more inclusive community. Because I believe ultimately that real power lies in our ability to create inclusive communities. So first, just want to share a little bit of background and kind of just give you a little insight into what my day-to-day looks like. So I have the great privilege of being able to be the chief change agent for a company called Flying Elephant. And Flying Elephant is an organization that has 4 different companies that feed into it. So there's Uplifting Impact, which I'll talk about in a moment, Purposeful Hustle, which, as Joe mentioned, is a leadership book that I wrote that really talks about how you find your purpose and then how you work in that purpose on a daily basis. So a lot of conversation about how do we get over, fear and what does it look like to really be continuously learning. So and in that company, I get to go around the world and really work with individuals who want to make a big difference in the world. I've had an opportunity to even present on this topic at Alverno because I feel like that's who Alverno attracts, people who want to make a big difference in the world. The third company is called Story to Tell Books. And as Joe mentioned, we have children's books that we put out into the world. Right now, children of color make up more than 50% of our school-age children. However, they are featured in less than 14% of books. And so what we are trying to do with that company is really change the narrative, making sure that all of our children are represented in our children's literature. I can see on the call there's some educators that I'm huge fans of, and I know that I've had many conversations with them. And they all come back and say, when I say, How do you get a child excited about learning? One of the number one things that they say is that you help them find themselves in the work. You help them find themselves in the literature. And so that is what we are trying to do. And my children, Zephaniah and Zion, they are actually the ones who run that company. So they are the co-chairman of that company. What we do is we take profits that come in through book sales and actually redistribute them to other organizations that are also supporting positive images of children of color. And the fourth company is called Birth Coach Milwaukee. So I am a certified doula. For those of you who that might be the first time you've heard that word, I'd love to explain what that means. It means that I am able to come in and support birthing people before, during, and after labor. We have a one-to-one model. So for every person who can pay full price, we can then provide services to a person who otherwise could not afford the services of a doula. Now, the reason why we started this company here in the Milwaukee area is because, unfortunately, Milwaukee has some of the highest disparities in birth outcomes in the world. But the research shows that if you introduce a doula or a midwife, you can eliminate the disparities at almost 100%. And so our goal through that company is to make sure that we have healthy moms and healthy babies, but also to make sure that we are eliminating the disparities that exist. So 4 very different companies. And I know a lot of people are like, wait, really? Healthcare? Oh, leadership? Like, how do all of these things come together? And the way that they come together is because they are all really pointed at what I feel is my purpose in life and what we have adopted as the company's purpose too. And that is to shift power to marginalized communities. So the other company that is not, that I didn't go into detail here, is actually the company that I'm here to represent. And that company is called Uplifting Impact. And through Uplifting Impact, what we do there is we really focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. There are a number of different ways. We have training sessions. Over the course of this last year, we've talked to over 75,000 people in over 30 countries. So really get the opportunity to be able to spread the word of what it looks like to incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusion. We also do consulting. I am a professor at the University of Wisconsin's Business School and their continuing education program. I wrote and am delivering a certification program. It's a professional certificate in diversity, equity, and inclusion through the university. We also do coaching. There's a weekly podcast. If you want to go deeper and see how other companies are doing this, we have a podcast called Uplifting Impact, and we also have a loaned DEI leader program. The last thing that's listed here is thought leadership. And as Joe said, there's a number of places that we write and podcasts that we're on and places where we speak. But the 2 exciting projects that are coming out is this summer, I wrote a book. If you're familiar with American Girl, the Mattel brand, I wrote a book for American Girl, really focused on what does it look like from a girl's perspective to be able to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So there'll be a girl's guide that's coming out this summer. Really excited to be able to work alongside the team at American Girl. I also am in the process, and this is big news. I think this is the first time kind of publicly that I get to say this out loud, but I actually am coming out with a book with Penguin Random House next year. And that book is called Actions Speak Louder. So you can be on the lookout for that. But that really is about how organizations can incorporate these ideas of diversity, equity, and inclusion into what they're doing. Now, I didn't go through all of this to be boastful. I am very proud of the work that we're doing and very proud of the team's work. But the reason why I wanted to share this level of detail with you is because I think it's important to understand that, first of all, I got a little street cred. Okay, so I'm not just coming out here talking about stuff I haven't done anything in. We've been in this and we've been in it for a long time and been in it in a deep way. But the other reason why I wanted to share it is because what I have learned in being in all these different spaces, right? And all these different sectors and all these different places around the world and having these conversations is that, honestly, the organizations and the individuals who understand diversity, equity, and inclusion and are not afraid to use the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion in their daily practice are the organizations and they're the individuals that are thriving. And I want everyone on this call, I want everyone in the Alverno community, I want everyone in the Milwaukee community to understand that and to be able to incorporate these into your practices. Because whether you're on this call as a community member, as a faculty member, as a student, as a staff member, as just a person who wants to learn and grow, having these skills and these tools are the very things that I feel like, as Amir was talking about the movement and talking about, Amira, excuse me, was talking about the movement and where we're going, they're the things that we need to be undergirded with in order to be successful. So, as a result of all these different places, one thing that has happened over and over again, by the varied nature of my career and the roles that I've had, is that I've been in a lot of situations where I was oftentimes the only one. And by the only one, I mean the only woman in the room or the only person of color in the room. And there's been a lot of situations where I literally felt like there was no seat in the at the table for me. And even when I managed to get a seat at the table, that I wasn't actually welcome. So what I want to do is I want to share a story with you. And I want to share a story about a time when someone literally tried to take my seat at the table away from me. So here is what happened. My company, one of the responsibilities that I've had throughout my career was to be able to be a foundation leader. So I was the foundation leader for multiple foundations. And there was a time where one of the companies I was working with made a large contribution to a really influential, internationally recognized organization. As the CEO at the time, I was asked to participate in this annual convening of this really big international organization. It was hosted in one of LA's most exclusive hotels. It was like one of those places you walk in and immediately you start saying things like, hello, darling, right? I don't know why, but like for me, at least, that's the way that, I sort of imagine you're supposed to talk in places like that. There was a literal red carpet and there was nonstop news coverage out at the entrance. It was the first time in real life I had ever seen paparazzi, right? Like standing at the front door of this convening. To get into the convening, you had to be fingerprinted. We had to be cleared by Secret Service because some of the industry's most powerful people were speakers and also guests. Again, to give you some context of this is like one of those moments where I was like, get out of here. But one of the vendors, like, the vendors that like you see in the hallway when you go to conventions and stuff, was selling private planes. Like, what is this, right? Like, what kind of space is this in? So it was an amazing experience, completely outside of anything I had ever experienced before. But it was not lost on me that less than a third of the people in attendance were women. And it was also not lost on me that only a handful of people in the entire space were people of color. I remember, and this is not to name drop, but I mean, kind of, okay, let me be honest, right? But I remember I was sitting in a space and Ava DuVernay, the director of Wrinkle in Time, leaned over to me and she asked me, are there any other Black people at this conference? After she spoke on a panel. To which I replied, yeah, I mean, but just a few. That was my moment of fame, right? I got to have that conversation with her. In fact, it was so striking that in my notebook, I actually started to keep a tally of the women and the people of color that I saw in each room. So I listed out the people who were in the audience, but also how many people were on the panels. Now, part of the reason why I was so taken aback by the lack of representation is because, and I kid you not, everything that the conference had put out and all the things that they said was all about diversity, right? Everything that they had kind of said they were going to do was about diversity. So it was very different than what I thought I was going to see when I was actually at the conference. I remember, I went to a panel and I really wish again that I was joking, but I went to this panel and the main topic, I don't remember exactly what the title was, but the main topic was something about the importance of having diversity. And every single person, there was 4 people on the panel in that room, and they happened to be 4 white men, all about the same age, all of them born into extraordinary wealth, all of whom went to Ivy League schools. It was like looking right at a panel of people who were completely homogeneous. And I remember that throughout the conference, the other kind of thing that really made this stick out to me is that the only people who engaged with me, so the only people who initially at least engaged with me, were actually other people of color. Every other conversation, literally every other conversation, I had to be the first person to initiate it. So conference is going on, and all these things are happening. And it was the last session, and it was a former United States president that was going to be speaking. Now, I don't know how you are at conferences, but I love some good swag. And there was amazing swag at this conference. So I had been walking around all day with my bag, adding swag into my bag. And so my bag had started to get pretty heavy, and I was wearing high heels. And so when I walked into the room, I thought, strategically, I'm like, I want to sit in the back of the room because my feet hurt and because I have this heavy bag. I also want to sit in a way that I can see the stage. So I made it, to that room, got to a table in the back of the room, sat my bag down. I was like so happy to get it off my shoulder and sat down at the seat that I could use so I could see the stage and have a really good view of the stage. Now, as I sat my bag down, there was a woman who was seated right next to me, and she was on my left-hand side. So for purposes of this conversation, we are going to call her Lucy. And I sat down next to Lucy. As I put my bag down, I said, hello. Lucy kind of looked at me. She looked me up and down, and then she turned her back completely on me. Now, honestly, at the time, I didn't really pay any attention to it because my feet hurt. And I was just ready to sit down and kind of, be on with it. So pretty soon what happens? The rest of our round table starts to fill up with other people. And there was just one seat left. It was the worst seat at the table. Of course, it was the one with the back to the stage, the one that nobody wants, right? When they're coming to sit at a table. And a tall white man came to the table and he started to pull the seat back. As he was pulling the seat back, Lucy, without acknowledging me, beckoned across the table to the man and said loudly to the entire table, you can sit here, motioning to my seat. She can go sit with whoever she came with. You can sit here. She can go sit with whoever she came with. Now, this gentleman's face immediately turned red. There was silence at the table. Everyone at the table just stopped talking mid-sentence and stared at us. And he quickly muttered, no, I'm fine. I'm okay. And he turned his chair all the way around, away from his food, and sat with his back to the table for the rest of the presentation. Undeterred, though, Lucy went on. No, she can move. Come on. You can have her seat. Now, as the event, I know you want to know what I did, and I know you want to know what happened, and I'm going to tell you, but you have to stick around to hear what I did. But I will tell you this, as the event was wrapping up, another thing interestingly happened with Lucy. A thank you slide went up onto the screen, and on the thank you slide was all the staff members of this host organization. Lucy again made an exclamation. Oh, look, there I am. Now, at this moment, I was even more floored because here was a person that was representing the event, the host of the event, and they had literally tried to give up my seat. So what I want to do before I tell you what I actually did in that situation is I want to reconstruct the story. I want us to think about what would happen if we were able to create a wrinkle in time. What would happen if we could go back in time and actually take steps that could have prevented this from happening in the first place? Here are 3 questions that I think that if we had asked ourselves would have made it so that this situation never even happened in the first place. The 3 questions that I want us to consider for the rest of this conversation are these. First of all, I want us to ask, who is at the table? The second thing I want us to think about is I want us to think about what is happening at the table? And then I want to think about how should we act at the table? Now, as we go through this, we're going to explore each one of those questions. And then what we're going to do is apply them to the story as a way to understand how inclusionary behavior could really change the way that we move and understand our own stories. So, to create an inclusive environment, one of the first questions that we always tell people to ask themselves is, who is at the table? Now, in this situation and many others that we're called to work on, the people who are at the table are often really homogeneous. In this situation, the people who were at the table were all white, most of them were male, and most of them were older. And even though there were differences, right, we were taught, or that table was taught, to mask them. So if we're reconstructing who's at the table, what could we do? Well, there's a couple of things that I think are really important. And there's kind of 3 steps in each one of these big questions. So the first step is to name the exclusions. Name the exclusions. So when you name the exclusions, what you do there is you say, who's missing? Who's missing? One of the things that we see all of the time in the consulting work that we do is that people forget to ask that very simple question, who's missing? I cannot tell you how many times, especially in the past year when we've been doing this work with people, I work with organizations or I work with leaders who say, you know what? I actually, before we started this work with you, Deanna, I actually never really looked around the table to see who might be underrepresented in our space. So one of the questions that I always pose back is, well, how do you think we're going to do diversity, equity, and inclusion work, or to even like the very first of it, right? Like the diversity work, if we don't have any data about who might not be here and who isn't showing up. So the first question to ask when we're really thinking about who's at the table is naming the exclusions. Who's not here and why might they not be here? The second thing to do when we're thinking about, and if this organization, right, who's at the table, if this organization had done some of that work, they would have seen, look, don't you think it's a little bit odd that we're having a whole conference on diversity, and yet we're really not very diverse at all in who we've invited? Right? That would have been a really, if we had that as part of our mindset, that would have been one of the questions that came up. So the second thing to do when we're thinking about who's at the table is to look in new places. Now, a lot of times what we want to do is we want to go to the places where we feel most comfortable. So it's time to do a new project. It's time to start a new initiative. It's time to come up with a new research project. And what do we end up doing? We end up saying, well, let me go to the places where I feel most comfortable. But the problem with that is that when you look at the research and you look at where we feel most comfortable, oftentimes the places that we feel most comfortable are the places that most represent our identities. And so if we're looking to have more diversity and have more inclusion, but the places that we go to are not very diverse, it's going to be very hard to find that diversity. And so if you are in a position where you're thinking about how do I bring more people to the table, one of the questions to ask is, where am I looking? Right? Where am I actually going? I like to use this example. If I was charged with, and I wanted to bring dolphins into the mix, right? I was like, hey, I'm going to bring more dolphins into the way that I want to include more dolphins. But if I only went to our local pet shop looking for dolphins, and then I came back and I said, well, you know what? I wanted there to be dolphins, but I couldn't find any at the local pet shop. You all, see, I can see you laughing now, right? You're giggling because that doesn't make any sense. Unless you live in a super exotic place, I can't even imagine where in the world you could find dolphins at the local pet shop. You're not going to find them. And so really encouraging ourselves to think about, how do I go to new places if I want to try and find more diversity? And the third thing is to evaluate your criteria. Evaluate your criteria. Now, I have to tell you that oftentimes when I suggest this and I say to people, you know what, one of the things that you have to do to be more inclusionary is you have to think about the criteria that you're using to determine who gets to be part of the team, to determine who gets to be part of the table. Immediately, and sometimes people are a little nervous to say this, but when they feel bold and they want to say it, or even if they don't, I can sort of see it happening on their face. One of the big like pushbacks that I will get, and one of the comments that I will get is, oh, so we have to lower our standards? We have to lower our criteria? But I actually love when I get that, because I don't understand why that's the first place that we go to in our mind. That is actually not the case at all. When I say I want you to evaluate your criteria, what I'm asking is not about lowering your standards. I genuinely want to understand if you even know what your criteria is. I want to understand whether or not you have done the kind of inspection of the criteria to know whether or not you have criteria that really is what you need for for what you're trying to do, or if you have criteria that might be kind of antiquated, right? If you have criteria that really doesn't have anything to do with the goal or the mission that you have in front of you. Because a lot of times we perpetuate exclusionary behavior by holding on to things just because that's the way that they are, right? That's the way that they kind of always have been. And so one of the things that's really interesting is that we say, well, what's the criteria that you have? People will tell us and we'll say, well, why is that criteria? And then they say something else and we say, well, could you explain, what you mean by that criteria? By we get to that third criteria or that third question, right? These pillars of, well, this is our standard and we can't lower, we just sort of disappear or they change. And people start to realize, you know what? That actually has nothing to do with what we're trying to do. I don't know why we had that. I'll give you an example that I often use. So one of the places that I end up spending a lot of time is with board of directors in for-profit companies and in nonprofit companies. But in the nonprofit sector, one of the things that we have in a lot of our organizations is we have this give-get policy. Give policy, excuse me. Have you heard of this before? It's a policy where if you want to be on a board of directors, you have a responsibility to give a certain dollar amount. And so the expectation is that you're going to write a check. And I get it. I mean, as being a executive director of many nonprofit organizations and being in the foundation and philanthropy world, I understand why that's such an important thing for nonprofit organizations to have, because it adds to some financial stability. You can count on it, right? It increases board participation. So there's many, many reasons why having a give policy is really important. But oftentimes I will push boards to put, and I like to call this the slash factor, right? Could you do instead of just a give policy, could you say, I want to have a give/get policy? Now, what does that mean? It still allows for you to say to your board members, part of your responsibility is to help us be able to meet the financial goals that we have stated. But what you do by saying it's not just a give policy, right, where I have to have a certain amount of financial stability in my own life to be able to write a $10,000 or $100,000 check, what you say is, I want to put the /get there, because what I want to do is I want to make sure that we can encourage people who maybe can't write that personal check, but who could help us find $10,000 or $100,000 or whatever our give policy used to be. Now, what's so interesting about this, right, is that when organizations embrace that concept and they say, okay, we don't just have a give policy, but now we're going to move to a get policy, is a couple of really big things happen. One, immediately the boards get to be more diverse, right? Because if you can imagine, what does it take for a person to be able to write a $10,000 check? Now, there are young people who are doing amazing things, but I think about myself when I first started in the marketplace, writing a $10,000 check. Are you kidding me? That would have been 50% of my paycheck, right, for the year. So there's no way that I'm going to see a lot of age diversity on my board. It's going to be much harder, I should say, to see a lot of age diversity on my board. Right. And you can go through a whole number of other things that eliminates. But as soon as you say, yeah, it's going to be a get policy, here's another thing that's happened. When boards have done this and they've embraced this idea, what they see is that now all of a sudden they have new markets. they have new places that they can go to. There's an entirely other like universe of people that they can actually reach out to, because now that they have a more diverse board, there are places where they didn't even know existed before, right? They didn't have any connections. So their friends grow, not just their pockets, but their friends grow. The places they show up grows, where the markets that they can go into grows. So it's a fascinating thing to happen. But I'm giving you this example, but I think one of the things you could be thinking about is, where are the places where I could put a slash? Right? Where are the places where we might have a policy or a procedure or something that really they're with a slash, a give-get policy, a give/get policy? We could completely change the dynamics of who's able to participate and how they're able to participate. Because the other fascinating thing that's happened with many of these boards is that they might have had a $10,000 you have to give policy, but they brought in this more diverse group. And guess what? That board member didn't bring in $10,000. They brought in $100,000. They brought in $1 million. Because again, they were able to use a different, and it opened up the board members who were only writing that check to start thinking more holistically about how they could even show up. So again, there's so much opportunity as we think about what the criteria is. It's not about changing the criteria and just making it lower. It's about changing the criteria so that we can help everybody rise. So the second question is about what is happening at the table. Oh my goodness. How many times have you had an opportunity or a situation where you walk into a room and you're excited because you're like, wow, I get to be at this table. I get to be part of this conversation. If there's any Hamilton friends out there, I get to be in the room where it's happening, and you get this like excitement. But then you get into the room and you realize, yeah, I'm sitting at the table, but my mic is not turned on. Nobody is actually hearing or cares about my voice. I don't know that I'm participating. If you never had that feeling, I'm so happy for you. For me, that has been a regular part of my professional journey. And it doesn't feel good, right? It feels really bad to feel like, wow, I finally made it to the table, but it doesn't even matter because I don't have any voice here. So there's a couple of things that can happen, and some things that we can do as we're thinking about being more inclusionary, some things that we can do if we are at these tables to make sure that what's happening at the table is also really inclusionary. One of the things that you can do is set expectations. We like to think about this as, what are the table manners, right? What are the table manners that we have when we come into this space? So when we think about, table manners and setting expectations, one of the big things that we think about is this idea of being able to provide training. So I love my children. And I know that one of the big things as a young parent, one of the big things that my husband and I talked about was, you know what? We want to be able to take our kids places, and we want people to invite us places, and we want to be able to go into restaurants and stuff. And we want to make sure that when we go into those places, people are happy that our kids are there, right? That they are contributing to the conversation, that they're participating in a way that is, everybody is feeling really comfortable. And so one of the things we did is very early on, we helped our kids understand, like, when we're at the table, these are some of the things that we expect of you. Right? We set those expectations for our children. Joe got to come over with our family, so hopefully he could attest for the fact that they know what to do when they sit at a table, right? They know how to engage and how to participate. That was something that we spent time training them how to do. Well, a lot of times when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, we don't really spend the time to give people the kind of training that they need in order to show up at the table in a way that creates inclusive spaces for others. Right? We kind of just assume that people should know it, that people should know how to behave, and people should know how to create inclusion. And I would push that notion, because the reason why we think that is because we oftentimes equate diversity, equity, and inclusion with just being nice. But diversity, equity, and inclusion is a lot more than that. It's a lot more than just, I just through osmosis sort of understand how to do that. And so one of the things that I often say to the business leaders that I work with is I say, you know what, if we were in this room, and one of the things that this group was charged to do was to do financial modeling for the company, or we were charged with putting a new brand into the marketplace, Would you feel comfortable with us doing, putting together the entire budget for the organization if nobody at this table had any financial acumen? Would you feel comfortable with us putting something new into the marketplace without anybody at this table having any training about what it looks like to introduce a new product? No, you wouldn't do that. So why do you have the expectation that people can come to the table and understand diversity, equity, inclusion without any training? So I would just push people to think, as we're setting expectations, how are we making sure that everybody at the table kind of understands this and has the training that they need? The second thing that I would say is that in addition to setting expectations, you also have to make sure that you're making space. So an easy way to think about, are we making space, is just even thinking about who gets to talk. I cannot tell you how many contexts I've seen this in, but I see this a lot in particular with women in organization. I see, women who say to me all the time, Deanna, yeah, I get invited to the conversation, but I don't feel like my opinion is valued. I don't feel like anybody hears me. And in fact, I just feel like sometimes I'm just there so people could check the box. And what is that? That is performative allyship. I will give you a story. I had the CEO, lovely, lovely man. He says to me, Deanna, I've gotten some feedback. I don't know what to do with it, that my senior leadership team, the women on my senior leadership team, don't feel like their voice is heard. And I don't understand it, because I love the women on my team. I really respect them. They're brilliant. I don't understand what they're saying or what they mean. And I said to this, again, amazing CEO, I said, I have a little game for you. Okay, we're going to gamify this. I said, for the next couple of days in your senior leadership meetings, what I want you to do is I want you to have a notepad with you. And I want you to just make a tick mark every time one of these things happen. Every time a woman gets spoken over, every time a woman gets cut off, and every time a woman has an idea that nobody kind of pays attention to until a man elevates it. Okay, so just, you don't have to tell anybody that you're doing this. Just go ahead and make these little tick marks on the side of your paper. I said, do it for a couple of days, and then maybe call me at the end of the week, or call me next week, and we can have a conversation about it. I don't even know if a full day passed. I get a frantic phone call from the CEO. He's like hollering into the phone. I'm like, dude, what's up? Calm down. Woo, what is happening? Can't even get the words out fast enough. Deanna, I just came out of this meeting and I cannot believe this. Why do any women work here? Look at my paper. He took his notebook. He took his notebook and pushed it in front of me. Look at my paper. Look at these tick marks. This is happening all the time, right? He's asking me questions and hollering at me at the same time. And I said, yes. This is what's happening all of the time, right? He didn't realize that it was going on right in front of his face. And that comes back to that first one of providing the training, of giving people the opportunity to practice and to be able to correct their lenses so they can start to see some of the things that maybe they're just not attuned to. Again, it doesn't make them a bad person. We all have different experiences that we bring to the table with us. So he didn't have any awareness of it. And when he did have awareness, then he was ready to go. What can I do? I mean, I think the comment of, I wouldn't stay at this job. I wouldn't even make it through the week if this is how I was being treated in a meeting. That was his reflection after just one meeting and having a different way of looking at it. So making sure that you make sure that everybody can talk. There's a couple of things that we like to do that are really easy techniques. If this is an issue that you see and you want some fast techniques, I hope you have a pen and a piece of paper, because I'm going to give you a couple of ideas. The ways you can change the power dynamic when you're trying to share space is you can actually set some expectations. You can say, you know what, we're going to do a round robin. And before anybody speaks twice, everybody's going to speak once. You can also make sure that people who might overshadow, right, like people who might be big talkers, you can actually give them another job. You can say, hey, for this meeting, what I would like for you to do is actually listen to everybody. And at the end, your job is going to be to report back what everybody said, to make sure that we hear what everybody is saying. Another thing that I like to do is make sure that everybody gets a chance to run the meetings, right? So that CEO, I was like, why don't you actually step aside and model for the rest of your team what it looks like to have the women in your team lead the meetings? Okay, so just some simple, those are freebies, just some simple examples of what you could do. So the third one here is about encouraging dissent. Because the other thing that happens is sometimes we get diversity around our table, but then we don't make any space for people to actually be able to show up and to share their differences in opinions or ideas or experiences. And so one of the things that I always encourage people to do is to make sure that in all the spaces that you occupy, you actually make it a part of your system, a part of your process, to make sure that people are able to express their dissent. And that if it's a part of your process, it doesn't have to feel like it's personal. So one of the things that we do on our team is we'll say, okay, it's red flag time. So whatever we've been talking about, whatever ideas we put on the table, we're going to go ahead and we're going to put up some red flags. There was an organization I worked with. We did this so often that my team actually made red flags. They put red flags on their pins, right? And they'd be like, and we get excited about it. So it changed the dynamic from being like, oh, this is a personal attack to, no, this is just what we do. We try and look for different ways to think about this, or what perspectives might we not be considering as we're going about the work that we're doing. So as you're thinking about how you can encourage dissent, you can put it into your processes. You can make it a regular part of your meeting. Hey, this is the time where you could say, you know what, we have this idea, we've been walking down this, but let's pretend like we didn't have any ideas. Let's start with a blank slate. What are some things that we might consider if we weren't already fully committed to this other thing or marching down this pathway? So just making sure that you're making it a regular part of your participation and your table, so that when people do feel differently, they already have a space that's totally authentic and completely appropriate for them to show up and to share those opinions. So the last one is one of my favorite ones. The question of how do we act at the table, right? We talked about all kinds of different things. We've talked about who's at the table. We were talking about what we do at the table, but how should we act when we actually get to the table? So there's a couple of things that I think are really important for you to think about, because a lot of us have experienced exclusionary behavior and a lot of us witness exclusionary behavior. So what do you do when you're at the table and you see some of these things and you want to do something? Well, one of the first things that you can do, and one of the easiest things that you can do, is disrupt the behavior. You can say things like, you know what, let's take a break. Let's take a break. It's super simple. You know, I think a lot of times people get like really anxious. They're like, oh my gosh, I saw this thing, or this thing happens and I don't really know what to do. And I don't know how I'm supposed to act. And I think in their mind, we've watched a lot of movies in our lives. We think we're supposed to like come up and have this super eloquent speech that brings in history and brings in good pedagogy and but really it's like, can we just take a break? It could be as simple as that, right? Refocusing, redirecting. Another thing that I use all of the time when I see things that are happening that I'm like, this is just saying something as simple as, you know what, this isn't reflecting our values, right? So you see something that's happening, this isn't reflecting our values. So understanding that sometimes when these things happen, I think sometimes, you know, I have people say like, I saw this, I didn't know what to do. I just like kind of froze, like all the people at the table, I just froze. In those moments, it can be really hard. So understanding and just coming up with what are your things that you might say that could just literally disrupt the behavior. One of the things that I like to say is, especially when I'm like really upset or I feel like I'm super emotional about something, is I say like, you know what, I don't feel comfortable with what's going on right now. And I'm having a really hard time expressing it. I can't really express it in this moment, but I want to put a pin right here. And I want to put a pin here because I will want to come back to it. And I want everybody to know what I'm coming back to. Another really good one is to say, you know what, I'm feeling super uncomfortable. This isn't going the direction I think that it should be going. I can't really articulate what it is, but if somebody else is also feeling that, I would welcome someone else to also speak up at this moment. Right? I'm not putting anybody on Front Street. It's not disrespectful. It's not confrontational. It's just let's pause. Let's disrupt the behavior. The second thing to do is to call it in, right? To call it in. Now, this is a little bit more. This is like 2.0. If you're like, ooh, I feel confident, right? Not just disrupting behavior, but I feel confident that I could also call it in. And the reason why I say call it in is because it doesn't have to be, right, like super confrontational. In fact, I would say try and avoid that, because you get into a confrontational standpoint and what do people do? They double down, right? It doesn't become a learning experience. So instead, saying like, how do I call it in? A lot of the times when I tell people, when you're thinking about calling it in, the best way to do that is one-on-one. hey, I saw this thing happen. Hey, this, really upset me. Hey, how do you think other people might have interpreted? What did you mean by this? Right? Being able to have opportunities where you don't just let it fly, you don't just let it go, but you really use this opportunity to reflect with somebody else, to call it in. So I always say some of the things to think up is to say like, hey, you know what? This is messed up. This is messed up. That's a simple way to do it. If you have to do it in a group because you're in this is messed up. This is inappropriate. And saying things like, I feel like we got off track. I feel like not everybody's voice is being heard. I feel like I haven't really heard from other perspectives. I feel like we're not really including everybody, right? And avoiding conversations that start with you. And also really using a lot of reflection questions. How do you think this, how might this, right? A lot of reflection questions. So besides disrupting the behavior and calling it in, the last thing to do, and this is the one I think people forget quite often, is circling back. I think it's important to circle back to the person who may have been part of the exclusionary behavior, but it's also, and I think even more important, to circle back to the person who was the target. Because I will tell you that one of the hardest things about being in a space where you kind of have this happen to you over and over again is that sometimes you feel like you're the problem, or like, did that really happen? Am I being too sensitive? Did anybody else see that? Does it even matter to anybody else? There's this feeling of feeling invisible. And so sometimes it can be unclear, like in those moments, what to do. But just because it's unclear in the moment doesn't actually give you a free pass to pretend like it didn't happen. Saying something as simple as, I saw that. That was super messed up. Here's how I interpreted it. Is there anything I could do to help you? Or is there anything that I could have done that could have been better? Just understanding and being able to recognize and see people is a power that all of us have, right? So as we're thinking about inclusion, one of the biggest things that you can do in inclusion is to say, I see you. I saw that. I'm here. So as we're thinking about these different topics, I think it's important to just remember that there's so many different opportunities for us to think about how we are looking at these ideas of inclusion and really framing it from the perspective of who's at the table. Are we naming the exclusions? Are we looking in new places? Are we evaluating our criteria? Also thinking about what's happening at the table. Are we setting expectations? Are we making space? Are we encouraging dissent? And how should we act at the table? Are we disrupting the behavior? Are we calling it in? And are we circling back? So now I know that I promised to circle back to you and tell you what happened during that actual situation. So I can't tell you exactly, I can tell you, exactly how these three ideas and these three questions played out in this situation. First, I thought about this idea of like, how do you change who's at the table? So one of the things that I did was I called the event organizers afterwards. And I said to the event organizers, I really want to share with you what my experience was like. And what was interesting is I told them about the table, and I told them about the chart, and I told them about what I had done in my notebook. And you know what they wanted? They wanted to know, what was the name of the person who did this? Every time I tried to explain, well, let me show you this notebook, and like, can I send you this document? And can, like, let's look together at the program. Every time they kept wanting to circle back to who was the person. And what I said to them was, I know the name of the person. Oh, believe me, I Googled her, right? Like I know a lot about this person, but I'm not going to actually give you her name. And the reason why I'm not going to give you her name is because what happened here wasn't about that one individual. What happened here was really about the culture that has been set, and an exclusionary culture that has been set and accepted. I asked them, the question that I want you to think about is, I said, why would your employee think that I deserved not to be at that table? What would make them think that I deserved to be at that table when everything else about the way the conference was set up was to send the message that people who look like me didn't actually belong, that they weren't actually welcomed? I encouraged them to focus on what they could do to help the entire organization think about what would have led to this being considered acceptable behavior. So instead of making it about the individual, we were able to make it about the organization as a whole. So the second question is, what happened at the table? Well, no one said anything. Literally, it was like awkward silence, right? Until I said to the gentleman, you know what? I said to Lucy first, with as much grace as I could muster, that I said, Lucy, I am not here with anybody else. Then I looked across the table at the gentleman and I said to him, you know what? I'd be happy to switch seats with you because I didn't want to sit next to her anyways, right? I had no desire to stay into that spot. But he had already, turned his back and had already had, I think, probably a super embarrassing moment for him too. And so then what I decided to do was I decided to strike up conversation with the person who was sitting next to me, because the table was quiet, right? They were expecting, I think, maybe kind of a bigger show. And let's call Ruth the person who's sitting next to me, since she was on the right. And I started to strike up a conversation with Ruth, and I started to share with Ruth some of the ideas that I had that were important ones, right? About why diversity was so important and why it was important to be included at the table and I just started to have this whole conversation with Ruth. Now I was talking to Ruth, but I was really talking to Lucy, and Lucy knew it and I knew it. But in that moment, in order to be able to maintain my integrity, I knew that I needed to be able to do it in a way that didn't make Lucy feel like she was being threatened, because that doesn't help anybody. So I had this conversation with Ruth. Now, let me tell you what happened about acting at the table. So at the end of the session, Ruth looked at me. Everybody got up. My goal was to go and talk to the gentleman, but he booked it, right? He was gone before. He was not trying to stick around, not trying to look back, not even trying to make eye contact with me ever again, right? All I saw was him leaving the session. But when I turned to pick up my bag, Ruth looked at me. And we had a lovely time during this luncheon, but Ruth looked at me and she had tears in her eyes. And Ruth said to me, I am so sorry I didn't say anything. I can't believe you handled that situation with so much grace. And you know what I did? I shared with her some of the ideas that we talked about here today. I told her that I appreciated the fact that even though she didn't say anything in the moment, circling back to me was really important. But I also said, but now you've had this experience. And I bet you it's not the first time you've had this experience. Maybe not this blatant, but you had it before. And so we had a great conversation about what she might be able to do if she witnessed something like that again. As she got up, she said to me, you know what, Deanna, of all the things I've experienced at this conference, this was the most important learning opportunity that I had. This is the learning that I'm going to walk away with me. Was the whole exchange awkward? Yeah, it was super awkward. But thinking about who's at the table, what's happening at the table, and how to act at the table is the way that we avoid these kinds of situations at all. So a lot of times people spend, people do spend a lot of time thinking about who is going to create an inclusive environment, right? Who is going to be the change makers that are going to create these kinds of environments that we're thinking about. But the truth is that it never is just one person that creates the kind of change we're talking about. In order for change to actually happen, we all have to play a part. We all, as a community, have to figure out what our roles are. So today, as you're going through the community conference, don't just listen passively to the wonderful people who are leading the sessions. Instead, make a commitment to do something with what you learn. Make a commitment to make your tables, the ones that you sit at, the ones that you have some authority over, the ones that you participate in, to make those tables bigger, to make them more inviting. Instead of giving up people's seats, make sure that you create a way to add more seats. Because this isn't about one person. It's really about our community as a whole. If we use diversity to create more inclusive power structures, what we do is not just good for our sphere of influence. What we do is actually good for the world. So my question to all of you is, what are you going to do with your power? What are you going to do with your power? I challenge you to use your power to empower others. All right. So what I want to do now is I want to actually open it up for some questions. So if you have some questions or some things that you've been thinking about, please go ahead and add them to the chat. And I know that we've gotten a couple of questions already before we even came into the session. Hey, Julie.
Hey, Dana. So I'm going to start you out with the question that that I got earlier. What if I'm in a field or area where there's not a lot of diversity?
Yeah, so I think that that's one of the big questions that we get all of the time, right? Is that I feel like I'm in technology, or I'm in engineering, or just name the space. And I think one of the things that's important to understand is that a lot of times when we are thinking about the work that we do, one of the biases that we have is that the only people that we can invite to our table are other people who might be from our sector. I'm going to make this even more personal, Julie. I'm going to poke a little bit, okay? Because one thing I know about universities, and it's every university I've ever participated at, sometimes it's easy to be stuck in our departments. Sometimes it's easy to be stuck in our offices, or stuck in, the spaces that are major for a student, right? Like I know everybody in my major, but I might not know other people in other majors. And so one of the things that I always encourage people to think about is there a way for you to be more cost disciplinary, right? In the approaches that you're taking. So whether you're in the fields already, whether you're in a sector already, are there ways for you to think about, because even just saying like, is that an antiquated idea? Like we can only have engineers who are going to participate in this process, or who are going to be part of this research, or who are going to be, or is it really an opportunity for you to start thinking even more broadly about how we might include people who have different disciplines? So one of the things that I always say is that it's also an issue of, if your field is not very diverse, how do you bring in more diversity from adjacent spaces to your own? The other question is asking, well, why isn't it more diverse? Right? What are some of the levers that we could participate in, that we could help pull, that would make that something that people couldn't even say anymore, right? That would really change the dynamics, so that we aren't continuously having this conversation. Because if you tell me your sector is not diverse today, and then 15 years from now, you want to have that same conversation with me, I'm not really trying to hear it. Because what I really want to know is, what have you done in the last 15 years or the last 10 years to make sure that you are adding more diversity into the sector?
Another question that came in the chat is, what did teaching your children how to act at the table look like? What were some of those conversations?
So one of the big conversations that we wanted to make sure that our children had, I don't know about you all, but some of us are sort of on a part of that generation where it's like, seen but not heard, right? So really, like, the table manners that we were taught was like, you come to the table and you be quiet, because we want to, like, because you're a child and adults are speaking. But one of the things that we wanted to emphasize with our children is like, no, you get to have a voice at this table too. Let's talk about how we do it in a way that can include other people, and that you can feel included too. So what are some of the things that you could do to learn more about other people? And what are some of the things about yourself that you would want to share that would make you feel more comfortable at the table? And how do we go about doing that in a respectful way? Right? How do we wait until we say like, hey, I would like to share after you're finished, instead of saying, mommy, 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 right? Believe me, we did have that phase. There's no magical way not to have that phase. We definitely had that phase. But really helping them understand, like, your voice is important. The other thing was saying like, hey, you know what? We're going to have these guests come over. There's some, here's some information about the guests, and here's some things that they do. What are some questions? So giving them an opportunity to think about some of the questions they might want to ask before our guests even come over. Hey, this guest actually has children too, or this guest lived in this cool place. Let's look it up. Do you have any questions about what you might want to ask this guest? So that they were also feeling really prepared to be part of the conversation too. So those are just a couple of things.
So I think we'll have time for one more question. What if I make a mistake?
Ooh, guess what? You're going to make a mistake. I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion expert. I get paid to do this. I go all around the world doing this, and I make a mistake on a daily basis. The whole thing that I tell people is that you have to be able to have the same kind of grace that you want people to have with you when you make mistakes. You have to have that same kind of grace with other people. So when you make a mistake, own your mistake. I did this. I'm really sorry. It wasn't you could say like, it wasn't my intention, but I understand and I accept the impact that it had on you. What could I do to be better? Right? So have grace, the same grace you would expect from other people, but also make sure that you're giving yourself that grace and that you're also giving other people that grace, because you're bound to make mistakes. The reason why we don't have inclusion, why we don't have equity, right, where we don't have diversity, is because it's easier not to, right? It's easier to be like, oh, I already know, I feel super comfortable, I don't have to worry about. But what happens, right? Do we see great change in comfort? No, change comes from a little bit of discomfort. It comes from making mistakes, but it comes from not just making the mistakes, but also learning from the mistakes. So what happens if you make a mistake? Well, go ahead, think about what you're going to do, because you're going to make a mistake, right? And prepare for that in a way, and don't use that as an excuse not to try, right? Use that as a challenge. I might make a mistake, but I'm going to try not to make the same mistake twice. Okay. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with all of you. You know, one of the things that happens to me all of the times is I will leave a session. I'll be like, I should have asked that question, or we ran out of time. And I wish, if there's a question that you have later that you come up with that you're like, you know, it always happens to me right when I'm trying to go to sleep. I want you to know that I love that I'm able to have a relationship with Alverno. Please feel free to go ahead and reach out to me. This is the way to stay connected with us. So join us on LinkedIn, check out the podcast, do whatever. If you have a question, go ahead and send it to us, because I really do care deeply about the Alverno community. I care deeply about the work that you do. I know how much better our world is because of all of you. And if there is anything I can do, even if it's just a tiny little thing to help you on your journey, it would be an honor. So thank you for being here with me today. Can't wait to see all the change you're going to make in the world. Can't wait to hear about all the wonderful things you're going to learn about at the conference. And please, please, please stay connected. Thank you.
Deanna, thank you so very much for getting us started off in such a powerful and inspirational and informative way. I think that that's going to provide a really nice frame for the conversations that are going to be happening throughout the day. And we're very grateful that you joined us. I hope that you know that you are always very much a part of this wonderful Alverno family. And anytime you want, we're always happy to pull our chairs up to your table. So thank you. Appreciate you very much. At this time, we're going to be moving into concurrent sessions for the morning. I will place into the chat in just a moment the Google Doc link with the breakout sessions and the links to those breakout sessions. You should have also received this as well, but just in case, I want to make sure that it is available for everybody in the chat. So thank you all very much for joining us this morning. I wish you all powerful learning and important dialogue, and I wish you all the best in the day ahead. So thank you and be well. Take care, everybody.